Most people think housing markets move slowly. They believe real estate is the safest investment because houses don't crash overnight like stocks. But history tells a very different story. Every major economic cycle eventually finds its way into the housing market, and when it does, the consequences can affect entire generations. Right now, according to many of the same warning signs that appeared before previous housing downturns, America may be approaching another major turning point. The problem is that most people are looking at home prices and assuming everything is fine. What they are not seeing are the deeper forces building beneath the surface: rising debt, high interest rates, affordability pressures, weakening consumer finances, and demographic shifts are all colliding at the same time. If these trends continue, the housing market could deliver a shock that millions of Americans are not prepared for. Ray Dalio has spent decades studying economic cycles. One of his core principles is that economies move through predictable patterns driven by debt. When debt grows faster than income for long periods, imbalances develop. Those imbalances eventually require corrections. Sometimes the correction happens through inflation, sometimes through recession, and sometimes through asset prices falling. Housing sits directly at the center of all three forces. The average American homebuyer today is facing mortgage rates that are dramatically higher than just a few years ago. Monthly payments have exploded even when home prices remain unchanged. This means affordability has reached levels that many economists consider unsustainable. People are not necessarily unwilling to buy homes. Increasingly, they simply cannot afford them. The first warning sign is affordability. For decades, housing prices and incomes generally moved together. There were periods when prices rose faster than wages, but eventually incomes would catch up. Today that relationship has broken down. Home prices surged during the pandemic era while borrowing costs remained extremely low. Families rushed into the market. Investors bought properties aggressively, and demand exploded. Then interest rates increased at one of the fastest speeds in modern history. Suddenly the same house required a dramatically larger monthly payment. A family that could comfortably afford a mortgage in 2021 might find the exact same home completely out of reach today. This affordability crisis is reducing the number of qualified buyers entering the market. The second warning sign involves debt. Debt itself is not necessarily bad. In fact, debt can be productive when it finances investments that generate future income. The problem begins when debt grows faster than the economy's ability to support it. America today is carrying enormous levels of public and private debt. Higher interest rates mean borrowers must dedicate more income toward servicing that debt. This leaves less money available for housing expenses. When consumers are squeezed by credit card payments, auto loans, student loans, and other obligations, housing demand weakens. Even if people want to buy homes, their financial capacity becomes limited. Dalio often explains that debt cycles eventually force difficult adjustments. Housing frequently becomes one of the sectors where those adjustments appear most clearly. Another factor receiving less attention is the lock-in effect. Millions of homeowners secured extremely low mortgage rates during recent years. Many have rates between 2 and 4%. If those homeowners sell their properties and purchase another house today, they may be forced to accept mortgage rates that are much higher. As a result, they choose not to move. This behavior reduces housing supply and creates an unusual market environment. On the surface, limited supply supports home prices, but underneath, market activity slows dramatically. Transactions decline, mobility falls, economic flexibility weakens. A healthy housing market depends not only on prices but also on the ability of people to buy, sell, and relocate efficiently. When that process freezes, distortions emerge. The labor market also plays a critical role. Housing markets depend heavily on employment stability. As long as people have jobs and incomes, they can continue making mortgage payments. However, if economic growth slows significantly, layoffs begin increasing, or business activity contracts, housing demand can weaken quickly. Even a relatively modest rise in unemployment can have outsized effects on real estate because housing purchases represent some of the largest financial commitments families make. If consumers become uncertain about their future income, they often postpone home purchases. This reduction in demand can create downward pressure on prices over time. One of the most misunderstood aspects of housing is that prices do not need to crash nationally for significant damage to occur. Sometimes the shock comes through stagnation rather than collapse. Imagine a homeowner who purchased a property at peak prices expecting years of appreciation. If home values remain flat for a decade while inflation erodes purchasing power, that homeowner experiences a substantial loss in real terms. Housing corrections can occur slowly, quietly, and unevenly. Some regions may experience price declines. Others may simply stop growing. The result can still be disappointing. For investors who assumed housing only moves upward, demographics represent another powerful force shaping the future. America's population growth is slowing compared with previous decades. Household formation patterns are changing. Younger generations face higher housing costs, larger debt burdens, and delayed life milestones. Many first-time buyers are remaining renters longer than previous generations. This trend affects long-term demand dynamics. Housing markets perform best when large numbers of financially capable buyers enter the market consistently. If affordability barriers prevent younger households from purchasing homes, demand growth can weaken over time. Commercial real estate problems may also spill into broader housing sentiment. Office buildings across many cities continue struggling with reduced occupancy. Remote and hybrid work models have permanently altered how businesses use physical space. While residential housing and commercial real estate are distinct sectors, they remain connected through financial markets, banking systems, and investor psychology. Stress in one area can influence lending conditions elsewhere. If banks become more cautious due to commercial real estate losses, mortgage lending standards may tighten. This can further reduce housing demand. Inflation adds another layer of complexity. Traditionally, many investors view real estate as an inflation hedge. However, that assumption depends on several conditions. If inflation remains elevated while interest rates stay high, housing affordability can deteriorate even further. Construction costs increase, insurance costs rise, property taxes often move higher, maintenance expenses grow, homeownership becomes more expensive from every direction. The financial burden extends beyond the mortgage payment itself. Families must account for a wide range of housing-related expenses that continue increasing. Ray Dalio frequently emphasizes that markets are ultimately driven by supply and demand. While housing supply shortages remain real in many areas, demand cannot be taken for granted. Demand depends on income, confidence, credit availability, and affordability. When all four face pressure simultaneously, housing markets become vulnerable. This does not automatically mean a dramatic nationwide crash is imminent, but it does suggest risks may be greater than many people realize. Markets often appear strongest just before conditions begin changing, because most participants focus on recent trends rather than future probabilities. Investors should also remember that housing is deeply influenced by psychology. During boom periods, people fear missing out. They assume prices will continue rising indefinitely. During downturns, the opposite occurs. Buyers become hesitant. Sellers become anxious. Confidence disappears. These psychological shifts can accelerate market movements beyond what fundamentals alone would justify. Housing cycles are not purely mathematical, they are emotional. Expectations matter almost as much as economic data. The banking system deserves attention as well. Banks hold significant exposure to real estate through mortgages and property-related lending. Although lending standards today are generally stronger than before the 2008 financial crisis, financial systems remain interconnected. If property values weaken substantially in certain sectors or regions, lending conditions could tighten. Reduced credit availability would create additional challenges for prospective homebuyers. Credit is the fuel that powers housing demand. When access to credit becomes more restrictive, transaction volumes often decline. There is also a growing divide between homeowners and renters. Existing homeowners who locked in low mortgage rates often enjoy relatively stable housing costs. Renters, meanwhile, continue facing rising housing expenses and affordability challenges. This creates economic inequality that influences consumer behavior across the economy. Large portions of younger generations may find wealth accumulation increasingly difficult if homeownership remains out of reach, since housing has historically been one of the primary vehicles for middle-class wealth creation. Barriers to entry can have long-term economic consequences. One scenario that concerns many analysts involves a combination of slowing economic growth and persistently high interest rates. Normally, central banks reduce rates aggressively during economic weakness, but if inflation remains problematic, policymakers may have less flexibility than in previous downturns. This could create an environment where borrowing costs remain elevated even as economic activity softens. Housing markets generally struggle under such conditions because both affordability and confidence come under pressure simultaneously. History shows that major economic turning points often emerge from areas people consider safe. Before 2008, many believed housing prices could never fall significantly nationwide. That assumption proved incorrect. The lesson is not that every housing cycle ends in disaster. The lesson is that no asset class is immune to economic reality. Prices cannot rise indefinitely if incomes fail to keep pace. Debt cannot expand forever without consequences. Affordability eventually matters. For individuals and families, the key takeaway is preparation rather than panic. Economic cycles are normal. Housing markets rise and fall. The people who navigate these periods successfully focus on financial resilience. They avoid excessive leverage. They maintain emergency savings. They make decisions based on long-term affordability rather than short-term optimism. Whether housing prices rise, fall, or stagnate over the coming years, financial flexibility remains one of the most valuable assets anyone can possess. The biggest mistake investors make is assuming the future will look exactly like the recent past. The housing boom of the last decade was supported by extraordinarily low interest rates, strong demand, and abundant liquidity. Those conditions have changed. The next decade may operate under a very different set of economic rules. Understanding that possibility is essential for anyone buying, selling, investing, or planning for the future. So, when Ray Dalio warns about debt cycles, affordability pressures, and economic imbalances, the message is not necessarily that a housing crash is guaranteed tomorrow. The message is that risks are building beneath the surface. Markets often ignore those risks until they become impossible to ignore. By the time headlines begin talking about a housing shock, the underlying forces have usually been developing for years. The question is not whether the housing market will change. The question is how prepared people will be when that change finally arrives. America's housing market may be approaching one of its most important tests in years, and the outcome could reshape financial opportunities, household wealth, and economic confidence for millions of people across the country.